Hello my friends, and welcome. This is the story about the sprinkling of Irish influence on Canadian life. From being the first Europeans to visit there in the 5th century, right up to today, where there is an estimated 4.5 million Canadians of Irish descent, and we also make up the 4th largest ethnic group. We all know that Saint Brendan is primarily renowned for his legendary journey to the Isle of the Blessed, as described in the 9th century book, Navigatio Sancti Brendani Abbatis, or Voyage of Saint Brendan the Abbot. Many versions exist that narrate how he set out on the Atlantic Ocean with 16 monks. They went to search for the Garden of Eden. One of these companions is said to have been Marlowe. The voyage is dated to somewhere between 512 to 530 AD. On his trip, Brendan is supposed to have seen St. Brendan's Island, a blessed island covered with vegetation. He also encountered a sea monster. The most illustrated adventure is his landing on an island which turned out to be a giant sea monster named Jasconius. Today we realize that the Garden of Eden that Brendan was talking about was in fact Canada. Legends aside, darker times in Ireland brought many Irish to the shores of Canada. Black 47, the worst year of the famine, brought in approximately 110,000 migrants. Nearly 90,000 landed at the Gros Isle quarantine station, before continuing to other places, including Quebec City, Montreal and Canada West. The second major point of entry was the Partridge Island quarantine station outside St. John, in New Brunswick, which processed nearly 17,000 migrants. A small number also arrived in Halifax, and other eastern ports. Roughly 1 out of every 6 migrants to British North America in 1847, did not make it through the year. They died in the filthy holds of coffin ships, in crowded tents on the quarantine islands, or in port cities. Most succumbed to the typhus epidemic raging at the time. The number of child migrants who became orphans in 1847 was unprecedented. Gros Isle usually dealt with around 10 orphans per year, but there were over 100, less than a month into the 1847 navigation season. By year's end, thousands of children had become orphans. The exact number is hard to determine given that many were informally placed out, and left no trace in the records. Approximately 9 out of every 10 orphans were Catholic. Public authorities, religious officials and private charities all helped cope with the orphan crisis. Initially, the government worked to contain the epidemic, overseeing the quarantine stations and many of the hospitals that looked after sick migrants. Religious officials and private charities nursed the sick, administered sacraments and found homes for the children. At the time, the word orphan usually referred to children with nobody to look after them, and who were directly dependent on charity. It did not refer solely to children whose parents had died. In fact, many orphans had a living parent who was sick, who did not have enough money to care for them, who worked as a live-in domestic, who had abandoned them, who lived elsewhere in North America, or who had remained in Ireland. Some children migrated with older family members, to join up with relatives already established in North America, and became orphans when these caretakers died, or abandoned them. Over a third of the famine orphans in Quebec City had at least one parent that was still alive. In most major cities, both public and private authorities built additional temporary fever sheds and orphanages to manage the emergency. Given the slow incubation time of typhus, many migrants carried the infection further inland. As a result, over 3,000 migrants died in Montreal fever sheds, over 1,000 in the Toronto sheds, and roughly 700 in the temporary structures built in Kingston. In some cities, these shelters were staffed by nuns, as in Montreal, where many Sisters of Providence and Grey nuns lost their lives caring for migrants. Elsewhere, such as Quebec City, the shelters were mostly looked after by laypersons. Churches fronted many of the costs involved in caring for the orphans, with money raised in Sunday collections and charity campaigns. In the latter third of 1847, the government stepped up its participation and reimbursed expenses for clothing, shelter, travel and medical help provided to the orphans. However, public authorities insisted that this aid was exceptional and non-recurrent, and that orphans should be rapidly placed out. Homes were quickly found for most orphans. For example, in Quebec City, orphans only spent an average of 1 to 2 months under parish care or in institutions. Many children ended up with parents or relatives. Around half the famine orphans in St. John were sent to family members, the majority of whom lived in the United States. For the rest, priests and ministers played a major role in placing out the orphans. They solicited their parishioners on Sundays, organized public processions of orphan children, and spread the word to clergy in other parishes. Most orphans in Canada East were placed in families of their faith, though not necessarily their ethnicity. For instance, over half the orphans in Quebec City were placed in Catholic Francophone families, many in the countryside. Conversely, the Emigrant Orphan Asylum in St. John deliberately placed most Catholic children in Protestant families, thereby facilitating their conversion. During these years, the adoption procedure in British North America was informal and non-binding. Although the word adoption was used at the time, it signified a reality that was more like foster care or apprenticeship. Formal adoption processes with legal guarantees of tutelage did not exist in Canada until the 1870s. Parents had no official rights over orphans placed in their care, and children had no legal claims on their families in later years. Census returns show that around 2/3 of the orphans were not considered sons or daughters by their foster parents. Despite this situation, the stories that have filtered down through generations suggest most orphans were properly treated by their host families. For instance, orphan Daniel Ty was adopted by the Colomb family of Lot-Bonnier, and eventually inherited the family farm, and passed on fond memories of his adoptive parents to descendants. Although some orphans were placed out 2 or 3 times, indicating an initial mismatch. Over 75% of the orphans who came through Quebec City stayed with their original adoptive family. Families had several reasons for taking in famine orphans. Many Irish families were motivated by ethnic solidarity. Others were prompted by Christian charity. However, most families were grateful for extra hands on the farm or in the household. This is why older children were typically favored. Younger orphans were more likely to stay in institutions until they were old enough to earn their keep in a family setting. In the decades after the famine, the story of the famine orphans became romanticized. Writers like John Maguire and Bernard O'Reilly transformed the story into a parable of conciliation between French Canadians and Irish. Adoptive parents were usually depicted as self-sacrificing francophones, who consciously sought to preserve the orphans' Irish Catholic heritage. This notion was reinforced throughout the 1990s by the Orphans Heritage Minute, which was broadcast regularly on CBC, Radio Canada. Since the last 2 decades, historians have challenged the myth-making around the famine orphans. Jason King looked at the construction of this myth, and Marie-Claude Bellet debunked it with figures and facts. Orphans were usually taken in for pragmatic reasons. They kept their Irish surnames because they were not formally adopted, but informally placed out. This revisionism has blunted the romantic edge to the famine orphan narrative, but some stories still show that conciliation across ethno-religious lines did take place. While some prejudice existed towards Irish immigrants, many Quebecers were eager to help them in their hour of need. Doctors, nurses, and Montreal's Grey Nuns volunteered to treat sick arrivals, risking their lives in the process. Many French families in Quebec also adopted Irish orphans, allowing them to keep their Irish names. In fact, many francophones in the province retain Irish surnames to this day. Working-class Irish immigrants soon became the largest ethnic group in almost every city in Canada, and found work building many of the country's iconic landmarks. As English speakers, they were regularly hired on construction sites, and played key roles in the creation of the Rideau Canal. Irish immigrants also helped to build the Lachine Canal, and St. Patrick's Basilica, in Montreal, as well as the colourful heritage buildings of St. John's, in Newfoundland. The folk music of Canada owes a great debt to musicians of Irish descent, particularly in Newfoundland, Ontario, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick. In fact, most Canadian folk songs take their inspiration from centuries-old Irish tunes, and follow Irish verse patterns. Irish surnames are commonplace, and we have quite a few other interesting connections with Canada, or as you may remember from the start of my story, Island of the Blessed, as St. Brendan called it. So here are a few things you may or may not know about Irish Canadian heritage. Did you know that Canada is home to the only Irish-language place name outside of Europe? When fishermen from Southern Ireland arrived in Newfoundland in the 17th century, they called it Tol Lavanisk, or Land of the Fish. This name still survives today, as well as the language that these Irish settlers brought. The influence of Gaelic, the Irish language, can be heard in certain Newfoundland English words like Sleveen, meaning rascal, and Streel, meaning an unkempt person. TCT champion, Alan Doyle, is just one example of a Canadian musician who can claim Irish roots. Stompin' Tom Connors and Denny Doherty of the Mamas and the Poppers both came from families of Irish descent. St. Patrick's Day is a statutory holiday in Newfoundland and Labrador, but this day commemorating Irish contributions is held throughout Canada every year. Canada is home to many celebrations on March 17th, one of the most prominent being Montreal's St. Patrick's Day Parade, the oldest of its kind in North America. Other Irish-inspired events include the Fáileach Seamus Grieg Music Festival in St. John's, and the Celtic Colours International Festival in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia. And that, my friends, is another story about Thailand and its place in the world. Canada sure sounds like a wonderful place, with such kind and generous people. We have a lot to thank them for, so thank you folks. One day I will surely visit. Thank you for watching and goodbye for now.